Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I have a wonderful guest today who is actually at the Mind Under Matter Campout Festival. Gave a wonderful talk that was very well attended, and people were so interested that we had to cut it off because we had other activities about to start, but people could not get enough of my guest today. Keith Markman is joining me. Keith, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'm still reflecting on the Mind Under Matter festival. It was a really good time.
What'd you think?
It was just so interesting. It was just such an interesting combination of things, comedy and music, and then the science. I thought what was really cool about it was, you had people who were fans of the podcast, but not necessarily, scientists per se, but they had this tremendous curiosity, attending all of these talks. You can tell the audience that I think it rained for probably about 2 days or so, but even in the pouring rain, people came out to hear these things.
Whoa! Stop slandering my festival. It rained for 4 to 8 hours one day. It didn't rain Friday. It didn't rain Sunday.
What I'm saying is that's how powerful the festival was. It didn't bother. Right. It didn't bother people.
Yeah. No, that's true. And actually, it was. When we made a triumphant return after the rain, that was super fun. And you guys did the smart move and got an RV for it. So
exactly.
You did it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely the move. That was, I was the most nervous that the science talks wouldn't be as well attended as I wanted them to be, because they're kind of the most important part for me. Obviously, I have a show that I interview scientists. I'm passionate about this stuff, and so I was very happy to see. I should have known, and I did know, but I didn't know for 100% that my audience was going to be as up for as many live science talks as they were. So that was it was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks again for being a part of it.
Absolutely.
So tell the listeners that many listeners that didn't get a chance to see you there, tell them about your work and yourself and your background and what you do.
Well, let's see. I grew up in a, fairly posh suburb of New York on Long Island, Great Neck, and I found myself at the University of Michigan. The folks over there. I was in a dorm room. I was in a dorm or a floor where there were a lot of Midwesterners or Michiganders, and they made fun of my New York accent. So I used to say wall and Paul and throw the ball against the wall and I'll have some coffee. And so to sort of mock them back, I would flatten out my accent. So I started saying sausage and water and things like that. And now I don't know what I sound like anymore, but the New York part seems to have receded to some extent. Although when I go back to New York and ask for water, they're like, water? So, I have to go back to that.
Soda or pop?
I've always said soda.
Yeah.
But again, just to fit in, I did start saying pop.
Yeah, you throw pop around when you're in Michigan for sure.
Right.
Eat some cheese curds, blend in a little bit.
Right. I went to graduate school at Indiana University. I did some postdoctoral work at Ohio State. So I guess it was a veritable tour, as we like to say here, of the Midwest. And I found myself with a job here at Ohio University. And I guess, in my graduate work, I fell in love with a phenomenon called counterfactual thinking. And this is if only or what if thinking. And I fell into it quite by accident. The person who wound up becoming my advisor kind of seduced me with the following story, and I just mean intellectually. He told me the story about, and that this was a true story in Canada, of a paraplegic couple who wanted to celebrate their anniversary. They had a car that was handicap equipped, but it was raining that night. And so they decided not to take their car. So they call for a taxi. The taxi driver comes, sees that he's going to have to deal with these two people, and he says, sorry, and he drives away. So these folks wind up getting into their car. It's got all the elements of a tragic story. It's raining. They go over a bridge. They lose control of the car. And one of them dies and one of them is seriously injured. Now, what was psychologically interesting about this was the headline that was in the paper the next day. And the headline was, cab driver's refusal cited in death, right? With the idea of being that, the counterfactual is if the cab driver had taken them, then they wouldn't have been injured or they wouldn't have died. And I thought this was interesting because that is the first thing that pops to mind, right? I mean, the first thing that pops to mind is essentially how the negative outcome could have been prevented. But then if you think about it for a while, that doesn't seem right either. Is it really the cab driver's fault that they died? And in fact, you could argue, well, actually, it's a combination of things. The fact that, that they were handicapped, it was raining, things of that nature. But it just struck me that those kinds of thoughts come to mind so readily. Sometimes they do help us to establish cause, but then sometimes they could be just sort of, not connected to that at all.
I often try to use counterfactual arguments when talking with bill collectors. I'd be like, rightfully, I shouldn't owe you this money because had you not come into my life at this time, I would have borrowed all of this. And
right. How do they react to those arguments?
Oh, they love it. They're like, totally. We completely get that argument. You are now debt free. Right. Fair is fair. Mm-hmm. And it works every time. Right. 100%.
So, after thinking about these things for a while, we decided, we came up with this hypothesis that maybe, the reason why people engage in this kind of thinking is because it's functional to do so. And so we drew a distinction between two different kinds of counterfactuals, mainly the direction of the counterfactual comparison. So an upward counterfactual would be, it could have been better, right? So I'm imagining a better outcome. I got a B on an exam. I should have gotten an A. I wish I got an A. I could have gotten an A. A downward counterfactual, on the other hand, what you're doing is you're imagining a worse reality. So it could be something like, this used to happen to me at Michigan, actually. I thought I was pre-med in the early going. And I was in one of these chemistry weed out classes, that 1,000 people take. Everyone takes the same exam. And I was very good at getting the mean, which basically amounted to a B minus. I wasn't happy with my B minuses, but I would come back.
Could have been worse.
Well, exactly. But it's interesting, what value does that have? So I would come back to the dorm, find out my grade, and learn that I got whatever it was. It was like a 12 out of 20 or 13 out of 20 would be the mean. And I would be bummed. And then my friends, who I was about to eat lunch with, would say, so what's the problem? You did better than half the people in the class, and you're at the University of Michigan. So it's actually pretty good. And that would be enough to get me to stop from ruminating. But there's a problem, right? So these kinds of counterfactuals have costs and benefits. So when you think about how you could have done something better, you think about a lost opportunity, you think about, these sorts of things, the cost is you're going to feel negative emotions, in particular regret, which is the, typical consequence of an upward counterfactual. But this kind of thinking could potentially help you prepare for the future, right? So by thinking about the things that you could have done, that you should have done, maybe you can implement those sorts of things in the future. So it may be functional to engage in upward counterfactual thinking for learning purposes, even if they do leave you feeling kind of bummed at first. The downward counterfactual, that was great for me. I immediately felt better when people said you did better than half the class at Michigan. And what did that do? That taught me how to keep getting B minuses.
Yeah.
And I didn't become pre-med, which is fine. But in other words, that can provide a sense of relief. You can feel fortunate, thank God. Gratitude. It could have been worse. But the cost is that it may leave you sort of complacent, right? Or to maintain the status quo. There are all sorts of other things I could say about that, but both counterfactuals can actually have the reverse emotional impact. Like an upward counterfactual could actually be inspiring. Like if you almost accomplish something and you feel like you're almost there, right? A downward counterfactual could actually be kind of scary. You're pulling out of a parking space and you're almost hit by a car, almost hit by a truck because you didn't bother to check your rear view mirror or side mirror, right? And so you're going to be sitting there.
It's amazing how vividly you can see that counterfactual.
Exactly.
Well.
And, that's not making you leap up and down for joy, right?
Yeah.
Nor is it, you don't really feel relief per se. You just sit there thinking, oh my God,
It makes an impact.
I could have been killed, right? And so it's actually kind of scary. So these things can kind of, they can work in different ways. But the basic
these
idea
hypersalient visualizations of these woulda, coulda, shoulda, and these downward counterfactuals of nearly crashing your car, it's very difficult to, there's no way of measuring how many potential future crashes they helped you avoid because of those many close calls along the way.
It's a possibility. Of course, I think that quite often we do things impulsively or quickly on a daily basis. And so,
right.
If we have time to think about the lesson, we might implement it. But quite often we're just in a hurry and the same thing is probably going to happen again. Some of the most poignant downward counterfactuals of this sort are actually reported by people who, survived 9/11, for instance. There's some crazy stories, and really books written about this. Where
Seth, what's his name? The guy that created Family Guy.
Right. Seth MacFarlane.
Seth MacFarlane.
It's funny that you mentioned that. So apparently this has happened to him not once but twice. Where he was scheduled to be on a plane flight. I don't know what the second one was. I know the first one was a 9/11. He was scheduled to be on that flight. And then, he switched, maybe a week or two before, the 9/11. Now, what's interesting about him, and apparently this happened again, the odds of this seem astronomical, but his reaction is kind of like, my secretary made those changes. So he doesn't feel like it was his own choice. It was just sort of like, this happens to me. This happens all the time, right? I'm going on this flight and then it gets changed to this flight. But
how has he not made some cartoon version of Final Destination? That's very wacky.
For all I know, I'm sure he's thought about it, but he doesn't take this stuff that seriously.
Right.
And I think it has to do with what you mentioned, which is the vividness of the counterfactual world. So, there are people who, they were supposed to go into work that day, but it was also the first day of school. for some people, they were dropping off their kids around 9:30 or so when the planes hit. They really feel like they normally would have been there. On any other day, they would have been there. They can imagine themselves being there on a really high floor where from where they couldn't have escaped. And then even closer, I read just a detail of somebody who was waiting for the elevator. As you can imagine, you had to wait for the elevator for a long time because it went up, whatever it was, 110 stories. And somebody saw somebody in the elevator as the elevator door was closing. And they said, could you hold that? Could you hold that? And, the person was rude or something and didn't bother.
They didn't hold
and
it.
then, I mean,
wow.
and this is just crazy. And then the planes hit.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you were in the elevator at the time, that
Right.
was no good. And so, people are left with this. I don't think that in cases like that, they feel so fortunate. They feel it's really kind of creepy, actually. Like maybe they should have been there, or they can imagine being there, right?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, I feel like counterfactuals are such a part of our everyday life too. I mean, it's easy to look at a thing like 9/11 and again, brains love salience. But there's, I mean, I think just in assessing who we are, I have several thoughts about the way that we there's. Some of our judgments of our counterfactuals are dependent on where we are now. So if we look back on like when we, this job that we lost 4 years ago or whatever, if you're doing well now, well, that was the kick in the pants that you needed, that opened the new doors, that did this and that. If you're doing poorly now, that was the nail in the coffin that you never quite recovered from. And it's the exact same action had happened, but your perception now in the future is how you judge that counterfactual.
That's a great insight, actually, because it's kind of like you're judging what could have been with we often talk about thinking about memories, right, through a rose-colored lens. Here we're thinking about hypotheticals through a rose-colored lens. So I mean, if the job turns out to be good, then you might be prone to also think, this was meant to be, what happened. Whereas on the other case, you might make the attribution that, you're being followed along by a black cloud, or maybe you just deserve misfortune or something like that.
Yeah. And also I often think about how, speaking of memory, the way in which we kind of, form and kind of reflect on these highlights throughout our life, I think are dependent on the on kind of the distance of that the imagined counterfactuals create. So what I mean by that is, and I'm going to say a whole lot of things that are ultimately going to mean nothing. Is that if you and I just met and you say something like, hey, how did this Campout festival come to be? Or you say like, what were three of the biggest things in your career or something like that? And I reflect back, I go, well, starting comedy. And then I guess, with the Campout, like, I guess meeting Ramin was a pivotal moment. So you have all of these and then, if it weren't for COVID, things would have gone differently. So you have all of these kind of pivotal moments, and I could think of like 10 different things that I could tell you, but you only have time for 3. And so the 3 that I'm picking, what I'm measuring that based on, subconsciously, I believe, is the difference between where I am now and where I would imagine myself being had that particular pivotal moment not occurred and something else had occurred. So even our assessment of who we are and the memories that we look back on, I think are really based on a lot of these counterfactual thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they really do help you connect, the past to the present, and sort of help you make meaning about where you stand, and certainly understanding where you are now as compared to where you were. Again, like you said, sometimes these could be self-serving, but if we didn't have this ability to do that, then we'd have a very incoherent sense of ourselves. There'd be no comparison point.
Yeah, it's funny. All of any. I feel like a lot of modern, or not even modern, I mean, this is like a very Buddhist approach too, but a lot of modern gurus and self-help people and this and that, often the goal is trying to rid yourself of comparing yourself to others or hypothetical selves of, the chasm between who we are and who we imagined we could be if we had only worked harder or had better luck or whatever is this thing that we get psychologically swallowed up in, and that's unhealthy for us.
Yeah, and I think that approach makes a lot of sense, to the extent that certainly to the extent that there's no future to improve on, right? Mm-hmm. So you can spend a lot of time ruminating about lost selves. This is the person that I could have been until X happened or Y happened, or I wasn't able to get that job, or I couldn't go to school in that particular discipline or whatever. And, you could argue that maybe you can glean a little bit of meaning out of that, but, maybe it's dysfunctional. And that if you learn to kind of, I think with mindfulness, what you're trying to do is sort of accept those thoughts. And then you just sort of let them go by in the Zen stream, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact of the matter is that, I'm going to hazard a guess that the majority of us don't naturally engage in mindfulness. And so what happens instead...
I consider myself a pretty mindful person, but I love to sink my teeth into a good rumination. I like to curl up in a fetal position and just kind of start counting through all the regrets.
That's the thing, right? I think regrets can be, there's a reason why our brain does this, right? Because it's making a comparison between where you are and where you could be. And if you could actually get there, then you might learn something. It turns into rumination if there's really nothing you can do about it. The other facet of rumination, of course, is that you can't really control it. So you have all these thoughts coming into your head. They're happening automatically. And, that's when you scrunch up into the fetal position.
Yeah, well, and consciousness is such a grand exaggerator as well that the things... when I get in a nice, rumination zone where I'm really getting a nice heavy rumination on, it's amazing. Or not even, sometimes I'm having a wonderful day and the silliest, dumbest memory will pop into my head, the nothing memory of some interaction I had. And like I ordered the wrong thing in a Starbucks or something no one would ever know other than me, and like I said, I fumbled on a word, and I'm suddenly that's popping into my head 3 years after the fact. Thanks, brain.
I think that this whole brain is, overall, it's trying to do the right thing. It's trying to adapt. And that, ultimately, again, it behooves us to engage in this kind of thinking, but there's a lot of chaos in the system. And so, of course, I know, and everyone knows what you're talking about, that, you can fixate on some of the silliest things. I wanted to bring up, by the way, I don't know whether you were thinking about this, but I had the pleasure of catching your final, your final comedic
my stand-up
performance, your stand-up act.
Oh, about the CrossFit stuff. That was a lot about rumination.
So besides that whole thing being brilliant in so many different ways, there was a very interesting thing that you said about, am I getting this right? There was somebody leading this group who asked you which year of your life would you remove if you could? And you said that what was funny was that people were right on it. They were like, 1999. And you said, wow, there's a lot to process there. Which year it should be.
I only get to pick one year. That's not fair.
Right.
I love a good rumination. I'm curious.
Yeah.
This is probably getting away from your work and maybe not something that you care to even speculate on, but we talk a lot about evolution and a lot of different wildlife and animal behavior comparisons and things like that on the show. And do you, if you were to venture a guess, would you say that humans are a bit more with our ability to seemingly our ability to think much further into the future than other species are able to? Maybe we're able to look back further as well. That's a tough thing to speculate on, but it seems to be the case. Do you think that we're maybe tortured by this stuff consequently a bit more than a lot of other species?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. We have this highly developed cerebral cortex, which is supposed to differentiate us from all of the other animals. And, certainly it's allowed human beings to kind of be at the top of the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
Compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. And we can invent things and do creative things, and we can help people and we can help animals. And there's a lot of good stuff that we can do. But in the process, if you take an organism and give it the ability to think freely, if that's what we're doing, I don't even want to get into free will and determinism, but let's just say for a moment, you give people the ability to think about a whole bunch of things, these kinds of comparisons and self-awareness. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, millions of people are on antidepressants, right? And we're starting to learn that, in fact, the neurochemical explanation for depression may not even be correct, or it may have to do with something going on in the brain with inflammation or whatever. But again, the point being that people can get themselves into these terrible states, right? If they're going to ruminate on what could have been and things like this. There are people who refer to this idea of the ability to look into the past and at least imagine the future as mental time travel. That has a kind of a fun name, doesn't it?
It is. It makes it sound a lot fancier than the everyday experience that some of us are running from.
It's funny. I actually taught a seminar. Yeah, because I'm very self-aware of that term. Like, it just sounds silly. I taught a seminar.
Sounds kind of cool at the same time.
It's kind of cool, but so I mean, I taught a seminar a couple of years ago that was called Mental Time Travel, and I made the following joke, which you may think is slightly lame, but I felt like I had to say this at the beginning. I said, "Welcome to the seminar Mental Time Travel. I just want to say that next year I'm really looking forward to teaching a course about actual time travel." That kind of broke the ice a little bit. By next year, we're going to figure out how to do that.
Right.
But anyway, mental time travel, the argument is that, in fact, no other animals can do this. There are some arguments that, like, scrub jays and some other animals.
Crow can kind of figure things out a few steps ahead. We're talking like 3 steps ahead to get a piece of food that is 2 minutes away, which is a little bit of a different scenario than what humans are up to.
But like you suggest, this makes us special. But it may drive us crazy. I suppose you could argue, I mean, it's the opposite too, though, right? We can fantasize about things.
That's true.
We can imagine, we can imagine brighter futures. There's hope. There are things to look forward to, right? It doesn't have to be.
We can build
negative.
Fantastical machines and structures and imagine things that we can bring into we can manipulate our environment like no other species.
Right. Right. We can do those kinds of things. Yes. And that puts us on top of this hierarchy. But I mean, you can look forward to, meeting somebody, a potential relationship partner, right? Whatever reality may not be nearly as good as what, as positive as what you may have imagined. But, it felt good to do that. And it probably motivated you to get out of the house. I mean, some people are worried that, I'm going to make a terrible impression when I meet people. I don't want to go to a party. I don't want to attend MUMfest because I'm not like those other people.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine circumstances or conditions under which these things could turn out positively, I mean, it does motivate you to get up, get out, do something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can send you both ways. Well, I mean, I guess if I were to try to make a philosophical case for humans being the most miserable species on Earth, I would say, I would say that you take any brain on Earth and you multiply its ability to imagine scenarios, and then you make the assumption that any brain with any sort of consciousness is probably going to have a very exaggerated inner mind's eye of said imagined scenarios, and then you couple that with probably every species on Earth having a relatively same-ish amount of negativity bias, meaning that the way that you're going to evaluate or remember or project into the future is going to be skewed at less than 50% positive. Then you calculate everything up, and you go, well, there you go. Humans are experiencing the most number of miserable potential future scenarios and reflective ruminations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and it's kind of like you wanted to be able to think about things and evaluate things and compare things. Here you go. And, we can really think ourselves into very, very desperate feelings. There's no question.
So this is cool. So this was the ideas that first, this idea of just counterfactual thinking. This is what first grabbed you.
Yeah.
Like very, very early on in your career. As we're speaking of counterfactuals and the sliding doors that made you arrive.
I might
at the
have
not
had somebody tell me the story.
Right.
And I might have gotten interested in something else and wouldn't even be in academia. Yeah, there are a lot of counterfactuals for sure.
Right. So then what was kind of the next stage for you?
Yeah. I've maintained an interest in that over the years. I think it's still my sort of bread and butter, but I've looked at things relating to regret, and also nostalgia. Again, I'm very mental time travel oriented, trying to figure out so nostalgia. It's a very interesting emotion. There's actually quite a bit of debate in the field about how exactly nostalgia is experienced. Certainly, nostalgia is experienced positively, in the sense that what you're doing is you're handpicking a series of memories, and again, the accuracy of those memories is questionable. But be that as it may, you're going back to a time, right, where perhaps you feel like you were, being more of your true self or your authentic self, or just a time when you felt like you were happy and you had less responsibilities and things were simpler. And, simply reflecting on those times can be a very positive experience. One might ask, what about just thinking happy thoughts or positive thoughts? But it turns out that thinking nostalgically, as opposed to just any happy thought, confers more of a sense of meaning and purpose to your life.
Interesting.
It can actually, a bunch of people did some studies during the pandemic, just about, people were shut in, couldn't leave their homes, whatever, couldn't see their families, friends. And some studies were done to show that, basically using a nostalgia intervention, having people reflect on nostalgic times, decreased people's sense of loneliness during the pandemic, right? So, and it can do a variety of things.
Can I ask what's the control? What's the so you said when you have you say just you give them a positive scenario to imagine or something like that.
Yes.
Can you give me an example?
The classic paradigm that's used, it's very simple. The event reflection task. You basically ask some people, this is the control, to recall an ordinary memory. That's it. For other people, what you do is you provide, because it's not entirely clear what people think nostalgia is, but you provide people with the literally the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, and then say recall, a time in your past when you felt nostalgic, consistent with this definition that I just gave you. And so that's often used as the control. And so what you find is relative to the control, people report more positive experiences, more of a sense of meaning, things of this nature.
But you also said that in addition, nostalgia rates higher in positive, having a positive impact on people than just other positive thoughts.
Exactly.
Like what's an example of just a random positive thought that you would use in a study to?
Yeah.
Is it a future thought or a present thought?
It could be just simply imagine that it's your birthday today.
Okay.
Imagine that you just received a gift from somebody. Imagine that you just heard some good news, right? And so this is compared to nostalgia. And the idea of nostalgia is that it combines a number of different things. You're sort of going back in time and you're thinking about a time that you wish you could return to. And that kind of thinking is supposed to enhance a sense of meaning, is sort of imbues the past with meaning, and the idea that carries over to the present as well, as opposed to just simply a happy thought. So it's the process of going back in time, thinking about it, thinking about why this was a good time. Like why was I so happy then? What was I doing at the time? Sometimes people will feel nostalgic about how they used to be nostalgic, or in other words, yes, they'll be nostalgic about lost opportunities, but they'll think about it in a positive way. So I remember back when I was in college, and it seemed like there were so many different possibilities. And I would sit around with my friends and we would talk about maybe I could do this and maybe I could do this and maybe I could do this. But as it turns out, for a variety of reasons, life forced me down a different path. But it helps me to go back and think about those times and kind of make meaning of them. It can lead people to believe things like, this is what I'm doing now is what I was supposed to do. That was me when I was young. Now that I'm older, I have more responsibilities. It's kind of a meaning-making process. Now, so there are some folks that say that it's predominantly positive. What's interesting, though, is that, in fact, it probably produces a range of emotions. It's actually a pretty bittersweet emotion. And, people have different theories about this, but I think one of the issues is that it becomes bittersweet to the extent that you feel like your, present self pales in comparison to your past self.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, like, if you can just sort of immerse yourself in that world of nostalgia, and people can do that in different ways. They're 40 years old or whatever. They take their first trip in a long time back to college or back to high school, and you can just sort of re-experience it, right? You're not necessarily comparing it to where you are now. You're just kind of, this is what comfort food is about as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I used to eat this, and you think about what you were doing. Maybe you think about your grandparents. Oh yeah, that was good. I didn't have to worry about all the I didn't have any worries or concerns. Yeah.
You look at the popularity of a show like Stranger Things, and that's got some nostalgia going on there. It's not not just the story, or you could have said it in any time period. It was that they really executed this 80s vibe. So
I thought it was very clever
so
to have Winona Ryder star in it, because she's sort of iconic of that time period.
yeah. And yeah, so it seems like people do have a lot of fondness for these nostalgia. Certainly, you get around the holidays. Christmas will be coming up in no time flat, and that always seems like a big nostalgic time. You reflect on some of those early gifts that you got as a kid, and those family gatherings, and
I think that's wonderful. On the other hand, that sometimes, like, people will play on nostalgia, frankly, for their own selfish gain. So I would argue, and other people have argued, my apologies to listeners who maybe have a different political orientation, but what is Make America Great Again?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we don't need, I mean, no apologies necessary, or offered. I think that, this is, so let's dissect that a little bit, because I'm wondering if maybe you could help me, keep from spreading my own misinformation. I remember seeing something somewhere about some nostalgia research that has stuck with me, and I don't remember the source, and I question it, but keep on spreading the information anyway.
Okay.
And it's that as people seem to age and get older, there's something with the aging process that seems to have people looking at the past with a more rose-colored lens, and kind of remembering those fond Christmas gatherings, and forgetting it's easy for me to nostalgically look back on happy childhood memories. It's also not that hard for me to intellectually go, oh, I was an absolutely miserable child from the age of 10 onward. Life was a nightmare for me from the age of about 10 to 23.
Sure.
I hated all of those years, but I can look back at all of that time and pick out little nostalgic things. And so some of this research that I remember, I don't even remember what it was, but it was saying you kind of lose, I don't know if it's a self-protective thing or whatever else, but through time, you lose sight of all of those, how challenging some of the far past was, and you just kind of hold on to those little gems from the past more.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't give you a specific citation, but I mean, there's certainly a lot of research that suggests that that's how people, deal with their experiences, even, after a very small amount of time. So I do know Daniel Kahneman and Barbara Fredericks did some work on something called peak end experiences.
I love that work.
Okay, so you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Say it for the listeners, though.
Well, I mean, it's this idea that people, people will remember the peaks or the most positive aspects, let's say, of an experience or of a vacation. Because of a recency bias, they're also more likely to remember the last thing that happened to them. And, this always resonated with me because, any chance that I can get, and I don't get that many chances, but let's say that I have funding to do this. I love to fly to other countries. So, I've been to a few places, I've been to Italy and I've been to Venice and Germany and Barcelona, a number of places like this. And they're wonderful experiences, but it is really painful to make those trips. Okay. There's a tremendous amount of preparation that goes into going overseas. It's very expensive. I don't know about you, but
it can be stressful and confusing.
Yeah,
I've done a lot of international travel.
I don't really want to sit on a plane for 10 hours.
Yeah.
It gets a little, sure, I can listen to a book on tape. I can watch one of the on-flight movies, but it's like, could we land now, please? And I've been subject to all sorts of things that I'm sure everybody else experiences. I've gone all the way to the airport, getting ready to go home, and they said, sorry, flight canceled, try again tomorrow. And it's like, I already closed up my hotel. Like, I don't have anywhere to go.
Right.
Things like that. And those things suck.
Yeah.
Those things suck at the time, sitting in an airport for 12 hours, 18 hours. And yet, you'll come back. And once you get back, you're like, yeah, that was great. We tend to push those things away and we remember the peaks of those experiences. It's interesting that our brains do that, given our brains' sort of countervailing tendency to ruminate and focus on negative things. When it comes to these kinds of experiences, that's what people seem to do.
Right. I mean, there's also I feel like part of nostalgia must have to do with kind of some self-assessment. If I look back on my career, like I kind of fell out of love with traditional comedy a long time ago, and I just use it to like explore other things and do science communication and do various themed shows and challenge myself in other ways and do podcasts, put together festivals and stuff. I wish I still liked stand-up. It's the thing that I'm best at, but I just don't care anymore. But when I get in like a funk about it, I often reflect back and be like, oh, but look at all these opportunities that are created for me. Look at how much travel I got to do. Look at all these amazing people that I've got to meet in my life. And then I get to, but then it can also make me feel like, oh, well, I had a lot of buzz going for a while there. And then I kind of went this other direction. And so it can, like you said, it can be bittersweet. And I do sometimes think about, as someone's getting older and if they're looking back on things with this rose-colored lens, with also having kind of, you have this embodied cognition where your perception of the outside world is being impacted by how you're feeling on the inside, which you're in a body that is falling apart and no longer at its peak and declining. That's clearly... And you're going to probably project that, just like when I'm hungover, I think the whole world has gone to shit. Um, and when I'm feeling better, I have a better perception of the world. And so if you're falling apart, you're getting older, your best days were when you're in high school or in your 20s or, decades earlier. And then you go, well, what's wrong? What changed? Life used to be so good, because you're forgetting all of the trials and tribulations that you faced along the way. And then you go, well, what's different? And then anything that's different is usually these like pretty salient social issues within a culture that's always continuing to progress. And then you go, well, it must be this progression of social life that's ruined everything, or these newfangled computers, or you just go, what has changed from those good times, from when Christmas was Christmas, and and then of course you want to make it go back and make it great again, because it was great, because you forgot how bad it was.
Have you ever seen Midnight in Paris, the Woody Allen movie with Owen Wilson? Oh, really? Independent of what your feelings about Woody Allen might be, this was one of his best movies. Owen Wilson probably, Woody Allen often cast the person in the lead role to essentially play him, and Owen Wilson probably does the best job. It's really a terrific movie about nostalgia, essentially. To make a long story short, he's in Paris. I think he's going to get married, but she doesn't seem like the perfect fit for him. And he's kind of a dreamer. He's a writer. And so not very traditional. And he wanders the streets of Paris. And then one night, and I know that this is going to sound corny, but a limousine drives up, and Ernest Hemingway is in the limousine. And then they go meet all of these other, writers and stuff like that. But what's interesting about the movie is that Owen Wilson is having a fantastic time in this era of the 1950s that he'd always romanticized, because this must have been a simpler time. But he meets a woman who lives in the time period, who's like, this is an awful time period to live in. I've always wanted to be, I always wanted to go visit Le Grand Époque, which is basically this like late 1880s, 1890s France, where there was the Moulin Rouge and Toulouse-Lautrec was sitting there painting dancers and stuff like that. So to her, there's nothing special about this time period. That's the time that you want to go to. But then anyone who's living in that time, they're like, actually, the best time would be going back to so and so, and so it speaks to this notion of nostalgia that we always believe that there are a better set of good old days, and that the good old days that you think were the good old days, well, actually, those are actually the bad old days for someone else. They'd prefer to go back in time. And this is all because of our brain's, tendency to erase what you said, the memory for the challenges and things of that nature.
Yeah. And people way back when, they must have been, smarter, more perfect, and had more foresight and everything else before the whole world went to crap. And so the more we deviate from, ideas of that are 200 or 2,000 years old or whatever, the more in trouble we're going to be, because we're getting further and further from those perfect deities that founded our country or whatever else.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I would love to know a little bit more about, well, I don't know. I don't know where I want to go here, because I want to know a little more about some specific studies, but also I love talking about conspiratorial thinking, and I haven't in a while. I don't know. What do you? Some of your work that you'd like
I'd
to
love
chat
to
about.
talk about conspiracy theories.
Let's get into it a little bit. We don't have a ton of time left, but I'd like to get into a little bit of it. Yeah, that'd be great.
And I should say that I've come to Well, I think I've always been interested in conspiracy theories. I actually was never sure how one would study them rigorously. And then lo and behold, just in the last few years, there are really a handful of researchers who've done a terrific job, finding a way to look at these and look at the relationships between, different sorts of attitudes, or which, what are the underlying motivations behind conspiratorial thinking. So I've come to this relatively late, but I'm running a lot of studies. And
me too, but I'm into it now.
Well, to me, so I'm kind of interested in the development, so how is it that people, come to believe these things in the first place? Again, I think that most, a good deal of the work is focused on, things like, when people are feeling uncertain, they have a need to understand the world. There's sort of an existential crisis, like COVID, for instance. There's a relational component to it as well, to the extent that, you derive, good feelings from being in a group that, believes in a certain thing, right? Flat earthers, right? For example, I watched, there's a documentary, it might still be available on Netflix, called Behind the Curve. And it takes a close look at these folks who believe that the earth is flat. Okay. And, I'm sure you'll agree that we know, objectively that the earth is not flat.
It's rounded.
It's an oblate spheroid, as it turns out. Anyway, what I found interesting about that is that there are actually very clever people who understand how to do scientific research. And they do a few studies that are so well designed that they would, in fact, provide evidence, if they worked, for the things that they believe in. So they run one experiment, just really quickly. Another one of their beliefs is that the Earth is not actually rotating. It's just still. Mm-hmm. And they design a study to show, essentially, that the Earth is not rotating. But the study is so well designed that if the Earth is rotating, there'll be a particular effect. And if the Earth is not rotating, then there'll be another kind of effect. And so they do the study, and they look at the data. It would take a while to explain what they did. I can't remember the specifics, but they look at it, and it shows incontrovertibly the Earth is rotating.
With their own studies that they designed.
Yes, that's what's beautiful about it. They actually conduct the research, but still, they gather around and they're like, well, then I guess the experiment wasn't good enough. We have to run a better experiment, right? And so, you question, why would people do this? And I mean, I think that there's some comfort from being in a small group of people who are really sure that they know the answer to a question. They actually are equipped to test their theory and to show that other people are wrong. And in order to maintain the integrity of that group, and the benefit that they receive, just from being in a particular group and being accepted, because most other groups won't accept them. They must feel like they're outcasts in some way for their beliefs, that it's unfalsifiable. So they'll just keep designing better and better experiments that show evidence for the prevailing theory, but they just like being part of this group that's going to continue to investigate this thing, who knows, for years.
I mean, also, don't you think there may be a factor too that it's your in fact showing your in-group solidarity by by incurring a honest, it's an honest signal when you're incurring conspicuous cost on yourself and becoming an outcast to the rest of the world, and therefore kind of the more far-fetched things that you can go along with, the greater the strength of the bond that you're displaying in terms of unity to the in-group. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what's going on. Just in terms of what I've been thinking about, I'm trying to focus more on what sorts of maybe belief systems or kind of thought styles are more likely to lead to this kind of thinking. And one of the things that I find interesting is how people deal with coincidences. Okay. And there's, of course, a running joke in the culture where two surprising things happen, or two people make the same joke at the same time, and you say, coincidence, right? And that's funny. And it turns out that you can there are a lot of people who want to believe, and actually I believe I'm one of them, without necessarily having a religious connotation. It would be nice to know that there is some pattern or order in the universe, even if you don't believe that there's a major deity that's responsible for it. Okay?
Yeah.
So when coincidences happen, people really think about them, and they are attracted to the idea that, in fact, really nothing happens by accident. That there are no, either there are no coincidences, or perhaps a lighter, take on that is that there are some meaningful coincidences that go beyond coincidences. They're not random. There is some kind of force in the universe, and to some extent, they'd like to believe that everything happens for a reason. That's really the phrase, right? There's a reason why things happen. Okay? Yeah, it doesn't have to be deity, but this idea of just pure sort of, things can happen, two things can happen at the same time, and it might just be random, is hard to swallow.
In combination with us, an individual being the central character in all of our own stories and books.
Exactly.
And so like these things are happening to us or for us or because of us.
Yes.
Too.
Exactly. So here's where actually, I linked to this, career-long interest in counterfactual thinking with, the beginnings of linking suspicious coincidences to conspiratorial thinking. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story. Now, this is actually a true story. What's interesting about the story is how people have reacted to it over the years. So this is the story of a football game that was played in 1940. I don't know if you've heard of this before. Between Boston College, a major football power, and Holy Cross, which is a liberal arts institution, but they're very close to each other in Boston. This used to be a meaningful game, in part because it was like, it was the snobby, it's all right, it's okay, you will work for, you'll all work for us someday. Liberal arts people at Holy Cross, versus Boston College, which is this huge football power. Now, every year, right, Boston College would routinely crush Holy Cross. In this particular year, 1940, Boston College wasn't just good like they normally were. They were actually the best team in the country. They were undefeated, and all they had to do was win this silly end-of-the-year game against Holy Cross. And they would go to the Rose Bowl and play somebody, and everybody thought, they were going to be national champions, right? So this is not a game that you can lose. I mean, this is like a minor league football team or a high school football team playing a major college champion.
Yeah.
Of course, you know where I'm going with this is that not only did Boston College lose, but it wasn't even close. The final score was...
Oh, I thought they were going to crush them just as expected, and you just picked a random year for no reason whatsoever.
That would be a great story, and that would be like
that's what you got to do.
Really
one
ironic.
Time. You should do it, but it's about the year before, right. And then you go, well, but also here's this year afterwards. Right. That's a little more relevant.
There would be some great, there would be like some great irony there, where you just tell this bland story. And then just leave an awkward silence there. And then they won.
And then they won, of course.
And then the silence for about a minute and a half. Right. Anyway. So, it turns out that they lost. And the score was something like 51-12 or something. Okay.
Wow.
But, okay, I'm only, just getting started with the, okay. So the kicker is coming. So, and you can't make these names up. The Boston College players, every year, they reserved tables at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston to celebrate the end of the year crushing of Holy Cross. So they had reservations for this place that night. But they were so distraught that they lost this game that they were like, screw it. And they all went back to their hotel rooms or whatever. Okay. Mm-hmm. The next morning, they wake up and learn that a fire began in the Melody Lounge basement of the Coconut Grove nightclub. It's actually a famous fire in and of itself, because it turns out that there was no escape. It changed the laws with regard to fires. So all basements have to have two modes of escape, and there were only the stairs. So something in the neighborhood of 500 to 750 people died in this horrific fire, right? So every 10 years or so, the Boston Globe runs a story to commemorate this event, and it's always told the following way. They lost for a reason. Okay?
Yeah.
So when you hear about the fire, it's like, now I understand how they lost a game that they couldn't have possibly lost. They lost. The hands of fate,
right?
Took them away from the fire and certain death. And when you hear the story get told, it is kind of creepy, actually. There is a creep factor there. So anyway, we've used this scenario and asked people various questions about it, and we have a control condition where they read about Boston College losing, but they're not given the information about the fire that they almost died in. Turns out that when you tell them the second half, that they almost died in the fire, they're more likely to say, I understand why Boston College lost. I believe that it was fated that Boston College lost. I believe that it was destiny. Mm-hmm. Those people are more likely to say that when they're told about the fire that they almost died in than people who are simply told about the football game. Now, in terms of conspiracy theories, I feel like there's something about this that reminds me of conspiratorial thinking and making something out of coincidences, right? And making a random coincidence seem meaningful. So what we did was we just exposed people to the one version where they read about Boston College losing, and then they read about the fire, and just looked at people's reactions to the question, to what extent do you believe that everything happens for a reason, after reading about this event? And the higher people's scores are on that measure, the higher their scores are on measures of conspiratorial mentality, the extent to which generally people say they don't trust the government and things like that, and also specific conspiracy theories as well. Moon landing was a hoax, a JFK, more than one person was involved, etc. So I think what we're beginning to see is that this kind of taking random events and, trying to turn them into something meaningful, right?
Yeah.
Becoming suspicious, maybe. It's suspicious that this happened and this happened on the same day. To the extent that people kind of like to do that and make meaning in that way, I think that that's, one of sort of the cognitive, mechanisms that underlies, people developing conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
I should mention that a lot of times people believe in conspiracy theories because, people like Alex Jones tell them. Right.
Yeah.
This is something that's happening. Sandy Hook was fake, things like that.
And they feel like they're in like a Scooby-Doo, they solved a Scooby-Doo mystery or something by getting this privileged information that no one else.
Right. And so if they put something together like this, I think that there's a real aha moment. Like, that's what's going on,
Yeah, it's a whole whirlwind of, you have correlation and causation getting mixed up with it. So I'm bipolar, so I've had full blown manic episodes, and I can relate to apophenia and imagining far too many. It's actually quite amazing how many connections and associations a mind can make, and also coupling it with like kind of a narcissistic you being the center of the thing happening, and like every billboard you see is like, well, I know what the billboard says, but there's also like a special message, like just for me. It's like a trail of breadcrumbs that you're solving.
It's like a delusion of reference.
Yeah,
they're
absolutely.
playing the long and winding road on the radio because they know that I'm on a long and winding road.
Exactly, but it's such a convincing, because it's emotional. It's such a convincing feeling, and that and then you have like especially this is I did a nice little dive through pandemic history, and it seems like this conspiratorial thinking just goes along with every single pandemic in history. It's amazing, and it's you have predictability and lack of control being two of the biggest stressors that we can face, compounded by the things that we've been talking about, which is our ability to imagine fantastical scenarios and think far into the future and everything else. And then
again, it's like yay, cerebral cortex.
Yeah,
fucking with us again.
Superstition comes out. We just did a wedding episode on Mind Under Matter, and I realized looking through the traditions that so many of these origin stories of traditions were hyper superstitious, and it must be like, you're making this very long-term commitment at a very early age back in the day, that for the rest of your life, there's a lot of unknown uncertainty going along with that. And then of course, a lot of superstitions as Halloween right around the corner. It used to be, this is the harvest before the darkness of winter, and store up everything, and everything's going to be brutal. So make an offering to the spirits and all this stuff. And superstition just seems to go along with rain dancing or whatever else goes with droughts for uncertainty and stressful times. And it's just what a perfect storm the last several years have been for conspiratorial thinking. And you had a conspiratorial president. It was like one step, like, Alex Jones was one of his advisors.
Yeah, exactly.
and oh my goodness, it's amazing, and it seems like a lot of projection too.
It's also amazing to me that so many people don't care.
Yeah,
I think that bothers me even more. It's like, it's so obvious what's going on here, and people are like, that's absolutely right, or
we're just gonna go along with that. in the hopes
So-
that I'll get like a better paycheck this year or something like that.
Yeah,
Like,
maybe.
oh, maybe I'll get $300 more in my bank account.
Mhm.
You won't. It's unlikely that you will, but
Tucker
a nice
Carlson,
thought.
by the way, is incredibly good at this because he
Yeah.
is super clever. And if you ever watch him, do his sort of long, monologues on Fox, he'll do this where, he'll start talking about one thing and then it'll be something else. And then there's a third thing. And he spins a narrative
yeah,
that's very compelling.
Yeah.
He's just very persuasive the way that he puts it all together. And I could see being mesmerized by this, like, oh my God, I'm seeing the truth for the first time.
yeah, connecting a lot of dots. Well, I mean, I call myself an epiphany junkie, and I truly am. I will read, I will watch a lot of boring lectures and read a lot of boring books and things just for those moments, those aha moments when it's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to see the world differently. I've never thought of that before. It's such an addictive feeling.
It's transcendence,
It really
and I
is.
think that's what
And
people are looking for in experience.
I know it's what I'm looking for. And if you can get it, and if you can get it in the manner of some like cable news junk food, version of it, I mean, yeah, you can kind of see the appeal.
Sure.
That, and it's like, I mean, also, the power of like those guys in Fox here, but I mean, they're preying on the right demographic, which is people that still have cable. So you go like, well,
Yeah.
people that are still using cable regularly.
Right,
What type of person is that? All right, they don't adapt overly quickly, and probably aren't interested in newfangled things, and etc.
They've probably been watching for so long; it's probably become part of that like dopaminergic reward pathway.
Yeah,
like you might actually feel a little off. Like you're not experiencing the usual, dopamine drip.
It's how my sweet grandma has
for a couple
decided
of days.
to spend her final years is by just obsessing about that stuff instead of sharing wonderful recipes and being the grandma that I used to remember. Now addicted to those things. Yeah, it happens.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think they're really addictive, and it's people have a hard time with that falsifiability thing, because I can usually tell people like, well, so it's just I try to stay away from beliefs that aren't falsifiable, whereas like you and I bet on something, there needs to be one way that you and I can decide who the winner is of this bet. So you can like look back at whatever moon landing thing or something like that, and if there's there has to be some piece of evidence that you or round earth, flat earthers or whatever, like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to run this test, and if it says this, that the earth is round, I win the bet. If it says this, that the earth is flat, you win the bet, and I concede that. Deal's a deal. And then, but it's still, you move the goalpost. There's just no way that they can ever forfeit that bet.
It seems like the best that you can do, at least as far as we know, is to not frame it as, it's possible to prove that you were wrong. Or of course, the more powerful. I mean, what usually happens is you get into an argument with somebody, and of course, you wind up screaming at each other and saying, "That's crazy, you're stupid, that's wrong."
And but then they say, I've changed my mind. It took you calling me stupid to realize the error in my ways.
And that's actually the therapeutic intervention that no one's thought of for all these years. Right? You just tell people that they're wrong.
Yeah.
But, it seems like if you approach it, you don't want to incite, reactance. People don't like it if they feel like you're trying to say, okay, so actually, this is the way that you should think. So you can approach it as, okay, so maybe there are a couple of different, I mean, you know that this isn't true, but it's better than nothing, I guess. Okay, so it looks like we have some different theories about this. Why don't you talk to me about, the evidence that you have for your theory? I respect your theory, your belief. Let me tell you why I, think the way that I do. And I think there's a little evidence showing that if you can kind of approach it that way, also, sadly enough, making these sort of, scientific or philosophical abstract arguments, those don't seem to work so well, but give them an anecdote. Now, we know that one anecdote of information is actually incredibly undiagnostic of anything. But if you say something like, hey, my grandmother got sick with COVID the first time, she nearly died. So she got the vaccine and, and she's compromised with all of these different kinds of problems. She got the vaccine. She's been wearing a mask. She didn't get it again for a year and a half. And then when she finally did get it, it only lasted for a couple of days, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that one example doesn't is not an argument, but people will actually be like, that's interesting. I'll consider it. So, like, whatever we can do, if we can say that's your theory, this is my theory, or here's a story about grandma who, it seemed like the vaccine really helped her.
I know. I mean, it's tricky. It's tricky accepting anecdotes into like a measured discourse, because then every anti-vaxxer that I know, they're just everyone that they know. Like every day of their life is just them stepping over the bodies of vaccinated people. Just everyone they know who's been vaccinated is now crippled in the streets and ruined their life. And it's just, I don't know a single person that's had like much of a negative reaction to a vaccine, but any anti-vaxxer who was against it from the onset, it's just every single person that they've met. It's amazing.
Well,
but at the same time,
from their perspective, people are saying you have to take this vaccine. It works.
Yeah.
And it didn't work apparently for somebody that they know. So that's some pretty convincing evidence to the contrary. So stop telling me, this is the way you need to think. I've got evidence that says you're wrong.
Yeah. I think they had that evidence before they had that evidence, which was, I think it was fake evidence. But yeah, it's. I mean, I was just hours ago. I had an interview with somebody who was asking me about the difficulty and like tricks with communicating.
Yeah.
Science through comedy and just science communication generally. Mm-hmm. And I brought up anecdotes and how, because I have an album, My Big Break, and I had written an hour of material that I was touring with about the negativity bias and the evolution of negative emotions and pain and some of the utility in them and depression and those sorts of things. It was going well. And then I broke both of my feet and spent like 9 months where I had to be on crutches on stage and integrated that into an already existing act with just adding a few things. And it was a night and day different. It like absolutely crushed once I had the personal story of the broken feet to go along with it, even though it was essentially the exact same act.
Oh, that's
but the level of response that I got was went from good to absolutely amazing. Okay. And that's what I was kind of telling this person a few hours ago, which was like, everything that you need to communicate science to the public is the opposite of how science is done. Mm-hmm. Scientists hate anecdotes of their work. They're trying to strip themselves of their human biases and get outside themselves and see things from this alien anthropologist point of view and strip everything human away from, because humans are faulty and muddle up testing objective reality.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
but then you go to communicate it, and those are all of the things that you need to communicate a good thing to a bunch of storytelling social creatures that love a good anecdote.
Exactly.
Very difficult.
That's our highly developed brain again.
Yeah. Well, this is terrific. Well, I'll have to have you back on again sometime,
sure.
because I feel like we could have talked for 2 more hours about all this stuff very easily. This was a lot of fun. So thanks again for coming all the way to the Campout Festival and everything. And
I had a really good time. It was great.
Yeah,
it was really great.
It was a blast having you guys, and and thanks for coming on the show. And
absolutely.
Thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. Until next time.